In our previous lecture, we talked about if statements and how they are a crucial part of not only application development but also game development. And before we progress in the rest of the course and we create our remainder of the applications that we're going to be creating, we still need to learn some of the basic functions and structural functions of creating such applications. And in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on NSTimers. Now, NSTimers are brilliant. I can't get enough of NSTimers when creating my own applications. What they allow you to do is create countdowns or timers within your apps. Such as if you created a game and your user only has 60 seconds to accomplish what they need to accomplish before the time runs out and it's game over. We're just going to simply create that countdown effect. They can be used in multiple ways. You can use them to, again, have a timer in a game, or just simply to count something up, to see you have a simple number at the end. If you're counting sheep, for instance, in your dreams, that's again another ability to NSTimers. So how we're going to kind of demonstrate this is a pretty cool way we're going to do it. We're going to have a countdown, and it's going to count down in our label from whatever number we select, let's say from 10 all the way down to 0, or we can have it go from 0 all the way up to 10. You don't have to have a defined number where it stops, but we can create abilities to allow it to stop and perform and trigger actions depending on what number our counter or NSTimer is currently on. So it's a pretty exciting thing, and I love using NSTimers because they're very versatile in what you can do with them. So first off, we're going to jump into our main.storyboard. We got a complete blank project for this one, as we're going to be working on the ground up for our NSTimers. So then, we're first going to have a button in our application. Now this button, when triggered, will again trigger our NSTimer to simply start counting. Now we can make it go either up, so we can go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or we can make it come down from 10, 9, 8. They can go both ways. It's a pretty cool thing you can work with. So I'm going to simply name this start timer, and then we're going to display the timer within this label. So we can currently see what number that it's on. And I'll increase the text size so it stands out that little bit better. There we go. Okay, so we're going to create our timer first. So we're going to make sure it's set up and that it actually works before we go on to add more advanced features to it and how we can control it. So we're going to select our files owner and then bring up our assistant editor, where I'm going to space out our outlet section and our action section. And then I'm going to add our button in first, making sure that's an action. I'll call it start timer and add that in. And again, add our outlet in, and I'll simply call this label. There we go. Now, there's also two additional kind of outlets, you could call them, that we need to add in. And they're basically our variables. Now, we need these two variables, as one is going to be our NSTimer itself, which is going to give us the ability to trigger this count. And then our second one, our second variable, is going to be an int, which is going to hold the value of our counter, whether that be like basically our numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, that we can use that to display it within our label. So just after our outlet there for our label, we're going to create our variable by doing var, and we're going to call this our timer, and this will be our NSTimer, and that's going to equal itself to an NSTimer. And that with two brackets on the end. So we can now refer to this timer, the name of it, like we refer to our label to display text within it, our timer, and our application will basically know that that timer is an NSTimer. We do the same, create a second one, and this is our counter, which this is going to equal a number. So just for the sake of making it equal a number, we're going to use the number 0. Now, this means by equaling it to a number, a value there, it knows that this counter is now an int. So we have an NSTimer and an int placed in within our project. Okay, so now we're going to close our assistant editor and go back to our standard editor. I'm going to go jump back into our view controller.swift. So the first thing we're going to do is set it up just so we can have our NSTimer working. We just want the basic ability to watch it start counting up from 0. And then once we've done that, we'll take it from there. So we're going to have it all trigger when the button is pressed. So we space out our two parentheses on our button. And the first thing we want to do is get our counter and equal it to a certain number. Now this is where we can have it equal anything. By default, we got it selected at the top there, it's equaling 0. Now this doesn't mean it can start at 0, we can make it start at 10, 20, 30, even like 999. You can have it equal to anything you want. but we're going to keep it nice and basic. We're going to get our counter. So when we press our button, it's going to get our counter and equal it to 0. So even though it's equal to 0 anyway, we're going to set it as every time we press our button. We're then going to get our label.text. Now the reason we get our label is because we want to display that value of our counter within our label. And that's going to equal a string. Now it's not equaling the 2 quotation marks version of a string. This is because we're using a variable. And we put 2 brackets on the end, and then the name of our counter, which is counter. That then converts it over into the string, which again I need to put a capital on the S. I've just missed that out. So that converts our counter into the string of our int into the string to display in the text attributes of our label. So that's all that does there. So it's not going to do anything else. So again, if we just go to build and run and just see exactly what happens. So as it comes up now. So when we press it, it's just getting our counter, equal it to 0 and displaying that within our label. So if we press our button, there we go. Nothing happens. We haven't created the count just yet, but we know we can display our int within our label. Okay, so now we need to create our NSTimer, the thing that's going to basically start the count. And all this is think of it as a trigger object. It's going to trigger a function statement, and the function statement is going to define what's going to happen. So before we go on to create our function statement, we're going to create our timer. So we called it timer, and again it's going to equal our NSTimer. Then we do dot, as we want the attribute of our scheduled time with time interval, and we need the one with the target and the selector. So in the first highlighted section is how often it's going to repeat our timer. Now, because we want to create a kind of countdown or a count up, whatever you want to call it, we want it to count up every second. So when it goes 1 second, it will add 1 onto it. So on and so on, like a stopwatch. So we place in the 1.0. Now, if you want it to count up every 2 seconds, then you just place in 2. And you could change it where you can do 0.1, so that'll count quite fast. So how often it updates the counter and how much it's going to count depends on how many times you want it to repeat. In the target, we're going to do self. In the selector, now this is what we do. We put selector, give our 2 brackets, and in between it, 2 quotation marks. And we're going to come back to that in just a second. Use info, we do nil. And repeats, we obviously want it to repeat, so we just type in true and out of a bracket there. Now again, like I said, we'll come back to the selector in just a second. Now what this time is going to do is trigger a function statement. So we type out func, and we do space, and I simply name this update counter. We've got 2 brackets on the end and our parentheses here. So the reason it's going to kind of trigger this function statement is every time when we press our start button, again, it's going to initiate our timer, and every second it's going to trigger our function statement, which within the selector here, we type out what our function statement's called. And it's called update counter. So it knows every second it's going to trigger our update counter function. And then whatever we place within the update function count or the update counter function defines what it does. And what we want it to do is add 1 on to our counter, thus creating the effect of a stopwatch or a counter or whatever you want to call it. So what we're going to do is get our counter, and we're going to plus equals our counter 1. So we're going to add 1 every time onto it. Now every time it adds 1 onto it, we need to update our label to display the current value of our counter. So just like we did up above when we made our counter equals 0, we get our label dot text to equal our capital on our S string of our counter and out of a bracket there. So again, this gets called upon every second to kind of perform or trigger this function statement. And every time it gets triggered or called upon or kind of told it needs to perform, it's going to add 1 onto our counter and display the newly updated format or value of the counter in our label. So let's go to build and run and test it out to see exactly how it works. Okay, so we just wait for it to load up. We press it, and initially it makes it equals 0, displays it in our label, and then our NSTimer triggers that function statement every second to add 1 on, creating our little stopwatch counter. Now at the moment, it just keeps going. It's going to keep going and going and going. And if I kept pressing the start timer, we'll trigger multiple timers on top of the current one we got running now. So we just completely got really fast. So what happens if we reach a certain number, or what happens if we want to stop the timer altogether? Now, these are all things we're going to talk about next. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, how do we stop the timer? How do we completely stop the timer from running so we can restart it? So what we're going to do is go back into Xcode. We're going to go into our main.storyboard. And where we've got this start button here, we're going to copy and paste it. I'll space it out there. I'll center them. There we go. So we've got our start timer. And now we're going to create this stop timer. Now, because I copied and pasted our first button, it's going to have the same action on it. So just select the button, go to the connections inspector, and get rid of the action that's been linked to it. That's only because I copied and pasted the button. So now bring up the assistant editor, where we're going to get our NSTimer, drag and drop that in, and this is going to simply stop counter. And make sure that equals an action and connect that up. Okay, so we've got that as an action now. We'll close our assistant editor and then jump into our viewcontroller.swift and space out its parentheses brackets just here. Okay then, so we've pressed our start timer. It's now counting up, and at any time we want, we can then press our stop counter, which is going to stop counting our timer. And how it does this is it gets our timer, which is getting called upon every second here. And all it's going to do is .invalidate it, which means completely stop it from working. So whatever number it's currently on, it will stay on that and it won't go any further. So again, if we build and run and test it out. So again, we can start our timer and it starts counting up. And whenever we're ready, we press our stop counter button here, or stop timer, invalidates our timer, and it won't go any further. It's now stopped on 1. And within Xcode, because we set our start timer button when triggered to reset our, so kind of make our counter equal 0, we can then simply start it all over again. And again, it counts up every second. And again, whenever we wanna, let's say when it gets to 7, we can stop it, and again, it's completely stopped. Now, we're going to talk about how we can create a countdown timer. So as well as starting that, we can stop it at any given time. We're going to reverse it now. We're going to take it back a notch. So this time, instead of adding 1, it's going to take away 1. And we're going to have our counter start at 10. So this time, if I go to build and run, our counter is initially going to start at 10 and it's going to take 1 away every time. So it starts at 10, it goes down, 8, 7, 6, as it's going to keep going. It's going to go past 0 into the minuses. Now, what we're going to do is kind of think of it as if we're creating a game. For example, you've got 10 seconds to perform a certain task. If the timer reaches 0, then you lose. That's basically what's going to happen. So when it reaches 0, we need to invalidate the timer, just like how we did by pressing the stop button. So we're going to jump back into Xcode, and this kind of revolves around using if statements, which we talked about previously in our last lecture. So within the same function statement, what we're going to do is if our counter equals, now if it equals 0, it's going to perform a task within the 2 quotation marks. And what it's going to perform is getting our timer .invalidate, just like what the stop button does. So if you go to build and run this time, and then we go to trigger our timer when it loads up, once it reaches 0, you'll then see it won't go any further. It's going to completely stop there because we've invalidated it if our counter equals 0. So it hit 0, and because it hit that, it's invalidated our timer. So we've kind of created that countdown, it's time for game up. But then how do we indicate that it's game up, there's no more time left, our user has basically lost? So what we're going to do again, once more, it's the final thing we're going to add on to our NSTimer, or our little counter we're using. And that is within the main.storyboard. Just like how we had the ability to, if it equaled 0, perform this task, such as invalidating the timer, we can do other things. So what I'm going to do is copy this and paste it in. Have a second one. Bring up the assistant editor. Let me select the files owner. I'm going to create this as a second label. Now, once our timer reaches 0, it's then going to display a certain piece of text within our second label, just simply stating it was game over. So I'll call it label 2 and add that in. Okay. Now I'm going to close the assistant editor, back into our standard editor, jump into our viewcontroller.swift, and within it. So if the counter equals 0, we're going to underneath it get our label 2 dot text to equal our 2 quotation marks of game over. So if you go to build and run once more, now this is all performing in the same if statement. So it's kind of like making the most out of what we basically performing. So again, we start timer, it counts down, and once it hits 0, it's then going to display in our second label that it was game over for our user. So this is kind of how it works in games and stuff like that. So it hits 0, and again, not only does it invalidate the timer, but it then indicates to our user it's game over. Now, another great thing is, if we go back into Xcode again, we can also, again, just look how we trigger actions to perform when the counter is at 0. We can get it to perform midway. For example, if we create another if statement within the update section here, for if this time our counter equals, let's say 5, create our parentheses there, we can get our label 2 dot text to equal another string. And I can simply get time is running out, we can place in there. So as it's counting down, this is a great thing as well. If it's counting down, when there's only 5 seconds left, it's going to indicate to our user that time's running out, so they need to be quick before it is game over. Now this is quite big and it might not display fully within our label. So what I'll do, I'll just space it out a little bit more and I'll center it. So that should be enough space to display all the text within that label. And again, finally, we go to build and run. It counts down, and as it reaches 5, it will read that if statement. So it reaches 5 now. Time is running out for our user. They get a little panic on. They need to finish it quick. And before they know it, it's hit 0 and it's game over. So that's a great thing again. We've not only created our timers to count up and had the ability to stop and restart them, but we've also created countdown timers from 10, and once it reaches 0, it completely invalidates the timer and it's game over, and trigger actions halfway through and the timer whatever it equals. So there's great little functions you can add there to any game or any application that you're creating. But it's not just countdowns that you can use your NSTimers for. And we're going to demonstrate this in the next lecture when we're going to be using NSTimers to display the current time and date within your applications.